In the Old West, they had a name for a woman like Alina Foster. They called her an impossibility, a giant, a freak. In a town where a woman's worth was measured by how small she could make herself, Alina stood a full head taller than every man. She was a living, breathing challenge to their world, and they made sure she knew it every single day. They mocked her in the street. They whispered behind her back in the church pews. They said she was built too grand for any man's home, too tall for any man's bed. And you know what? They were right. No ordinary man could build a home for a woman like Alina. It was going to take a giant. The dust in 1878 Arizona had a flavor. It tasted like failure. It coated your tongue, filled your lungs, and clung to every last one of your dreams until they turned the same lifeless brown as the dirt beneath your feet. For 22-year-old Alina Foster, it was the only taste she'd ever known. Her life was a series of ducks and stoops, ducking under doorways that were built for smaller people, stooping to speak to men whose pride was as fragile as a robin's egg. She lived with her aunt and uncle, Mary and Thomas, good people worn down to the bone by hardship, and Alina, their giant, unmarriable niece, was just one more hardship to bear. "You slouch, child," her aunt would sigh, and Alina would think, "If I stand up straight, I'll bring the whole house down around us." The cruelty wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. It was the way the men outside the saloon would suddenly find something interesting to look at on the ground when she walked by. It was the tight, pitying smiles of the other women. It was the children who would stretch their necks up, mimicking her, before a parent would snatch them away, hissing. It was 1,000 tiny paper cuts, every single day, for 7 long years. And her spirit had been bled dry. The worst of them all was Andrew Croft. He was the son of the richest man in the county, and he had a handsome face that was spoiled by a pair of cold, dead eyes. He'd decided that Alina's existence was his personal circus, and he was the ringmaster. He got his big chance at the annual Founders' Day social. Picture it. The new town hall, barely finished, lanterns hanging from the rafters. The air is thick with sweat and the cheap perfume of lonely women. All the unmarried girls are lined up against one wall, fanning their flushed faces, trying to look pretty, trying to look small, and at the very end of the line, trying to blend into the wood of the wall itself, is Alina. She feels like a grizzly bear that's wandered into a dollhouse. Andrew Croft, drunk on whiskey and his own importance, saunters into the center of the room. His voice booms, silencing the nervous chatter. "Well now, boys, look at the fine prospects we have this year." He starts down the line, pointing. "There's little Lucy Miller, sweet as a desert flower, and Rebecca May, whose biscuits are almost as famous as her smile." The men chuckle. The women blush. Then his eyes land on Alina. A wicked smile spreads across his face. He stops and points his finger directly at her. The fiddler's music scrapes to a halt. The room goes dead silent. Every single eye in Dust Devil Creek turns to the tall girl at the end of the line. "And then," Andrew bellows, "we have the grand prize." He walks toward her, circling her like a vulture. "Miss Alina Foster, a man wouldn't need a ladder to fix his roof with a wife like that. Just have her stand on the porch and hand him the shingles." A wave of ugly laughter washes over the room. It's sharp and cruel. Alina feels a hot fire crawl up her neck. Her face burns, hotter than any Arizona sun. She can feel her aunt's horrified stare from across the room, but she doesn't dare look. Andrew leans in close, his breath stinking of whiskey. He drops his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, but it's loud enough for everyone to hear. "Tell me, Alina," he hisses, "when you finally manage to rope some poor fool into marrying you, where are you going to find a bed that's long enough? Or will you just make the poor fella sleep curled up at your feet like a dog?" The laughter explodes. It's a physical thing, a wave of sound that crashes over her, drowning her. She can't breathe. Her vision blurs. All she sees is a sea of open mouths, teeth bared, laughing at her pain. She doesn't run. She will not give them the satisfaction. With a rigid spine that she prays looks like dignity, she turns. She pushes through the crowd. She walks toward the door. She doesn't duck. The sharp, sudden crack of her skull against the wooden lintel is a welcome, grounding pain. It's real. It's something she can focus on, other than the sound of her own soul shattering into a million pieces. She walks out into the vast, empty darkness of the desert. She walks until the sounds of the town are gone, replaced by the yip of a distant coyote. She walks until she can't walk anymore. She collapses at the edge of a dry arroyo, the sharp rocks digging into her knees. And there, under the cold, merciless light of a silver moon, she finally lets herself break. She weeps for the girl she used to be, and for the woman they would never let her become. Why? She whispers to the unblinking stars. Why did you make me this way? The desert, as always, offers no answer. In Dust Devil Creek, a woman's worth was measured by her ability to find a husband. And tonight, the town had passed its final judgment. Alina Foster was worthless. And kneeling there, alone in the dark, she finally believed them. A week later, a new shadow fell over Dust Devil Creek. It was long, dark, and it made Alina Foster look merely tall. He didn't ride into town, he walked. Beside him was a tired-looking mule, loaded down with tools and a heavy canvas roll. The man was immense, not just tall, but wide, solid, like he'd been carved from the granite of the mesas themselves. He had to be well over 6.5 feet, with shoulders that looked as wide as the town's main street. His skin was the color of rich, sun-baked earth, and a single thick braid of jet black hair hung down his back. His face was a landscape of harsh lines and old scars, dominated by a nose that had clearly been broken more than once. But it was his eyes that stopped you. They were dark, deep-set, and they missed nothing. The town went quiet. Men stopped whittling on the porches. Women pulled their children in close. They saw the high cheekbones, the color of his skin, and a single word was whispered from the saloon to the mercantile. Cherokee. He walked with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed impossible for a man his size. He didn't swagger. He didn't try to intimidate. He just was. A fact as solid and undeniable as the sunrise. He stopped at the blacksmith shop where Alina's uncle Thomas was working. Thomas looked up from his anvil, his eyes widening just a fraction. The giant ran a hand over his mule's flank, a hand big enough to palm a cannonball. Then he looked at Thomas. "Need shoes for the mule," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like thunder in a distant canyon. "And water. Name's Noah." He offered no last name. In the West, that wasn't strange. But for a man who so clearly came from the tribes the settlers both feared and hated, it was a statement. "This is who I am. Take it or leave it." Thomas, a man who judged people by the calluses on their hands, not the color of their skin, just nodded. "I can do that. Water trough is over yonder. 4 bits." Noah paid him, and the simple transaction should have been the end of it. But the rest of the town was watching, holding its breath, waiting for the violence they were sure was coming. Andrew Croft and 2 of his thugs were standing across the street, their arms crossed, their faces twisted into masks of open hostility. Alina was inside the house kneading bread when she saw him through the kitchen window. She froze, her hands buried in dough. For the first time in her life, she was looking at a man who was significantly taller than she was. It was a strange, dizzying feeling. He wasn't just a man, he was a piece of the mountain, walking. She saw Andrew watching him, and the familiar knot of fear tightened in her gut. Trouble, it turned out, wasn't going to let Noah just pass through. As he finished with the mule ready to leave, Andrew Croft and his men swaggered across the street, blocking his path. "Well, well," Andrew drawled, his voice dripping with venom. "Look what the trail coughed up. You lost, Chief?" Noah's expression didn't change. His dark eyes rested on Andrew, as calm and unreadable as a deep pool of water. He just stood there, a mountain of a man, waiting. His silence seemed to infuriate Andrew more than any threat could have. "Cat got your tongue?" Andrew taunted, stepping closer. He was a tall man himself, but he had to crane his neck to look up at Noah. "We don't take kindly to your sort around here. Best you keep moving." Noah shifted his weight, just a slight movement, but it was pregnant with coiled, terrifying power. "I'm just passing through," he rumbled. "See that you do," Andrew spat. He was furious that the man refused to be baited, refused to be afraid. He gestured at Alina's uncle. "And you, Patton. You be careful who you do business with. Stinks up the whole town." Before Thomas could even reply, the back door of the house creaked open. Alina stepped out. She was holding a bucket of scraps for the chickens. She hadn't meant to step in, but she couldn't stand there and listen to her uncle be insulted. Her sudden appearance, tall and unexpected, drew every eye. For a moment, a strange tableau was frozen in the dusty yard. The towering, silent Cherokee man, the arrogant rancher's son, and the woman who was too tall for the town. Andrew's sneer faltered for a half-second. Seeing the two of them in the same space, it was like something out of a freak show. But he recovered quickly, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Well, look at this. Maybe he's not lost after all. Maybe he's come calling on our own giantess. You two could build a nest on a treetop somewhere." His ranch hands cackled like hyenas. The familiar, sickening heat of shame washed over Alina. But this time, something else was mixed in with it. Something hot and pure. Anger. She looked from Andrew's mocking face to Noah's. His eyes flickered to hers for just a fraction of a second. There was no pity in them, no amusement. There was only recognition. It was the silent, profound acknowledgement of one outsider seeing another. Noah turned his gaze back to Andrew. He took one slow step forward. Andrew and his men, despite being 3-1, instinctively shuffled backward. "I've paid for my business," Noah said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. "I'll be on my way." And with that, he turned, gathered his mule's lead, and walked away. He didn't look back. He just left Andrew Croft fuming in the middle of the street, robbed of his confrontation. Andrew shot a hateful glare at Alina before stomping off toward the saloon. Alina stood frozen, the bucket handle digging into her palm. That brief, shared glance with the stranger had shaken her more than all of Andrew's taunts. In that fleeting moment, she hadn't felt like a freak. She had simply felt seen. 2 days later, a dusty circuit lawyer named Mr. Abernathy rode into town, and he brought with him a piece of paper that would change Alina's life forever. He found her at her uncle's shop. "Miss Alina Foster?" he asked, peering at her over his spectacles. "Yes, sir. I bring you news concerning the estate of your great-aunt, Sadie Finch." Alina vaguely remembered a reclusive, stern old woman who lived miles out of town, a woman she'd met only once as a small child. "She passed on 2 months ago," the lawyer continued, pulling a deed from his satchel. "She had no other living relatives. In her will, she left you her property." He handed her the paper. "It's not much, I'm afraid. 30 acres of rock and scrub, about 5 miles north of here. The cabin on it collapsed years ago. Most folks consider the land worthless." He coughed. "But it is yours, all legal and filed with the territorial office." Alina took the deed. Her fingers traced the spidery script of her own name. Alina Foster, owner. It was a word she'd never associated with herself. Owner. Her aunt and uncle were relieved. It was a place for her to go, a polite form of exile. But for Alina, holding that piece of paper, a wild, impossible idea began to take root in the dry soil of her heart. A house, a place of her own. A home with doors she wouldn't have to duck through and ceilings that didn't press down on her head. A place where she wouldn't be a burden, where she wouldn't be a spectacle. It was insane. She had no money, no skills. The land was worthless. It was a fool's dream. But it was her fool's dream. And as she stood there, clutching the deed to 30 acres of rock and scrub, she remembered the silent giant named Noah, the builder, the other outsider. And the seed of that impossible idea began to sprout. The first week on her land taught Alina a brutal lesson. The desert did not care about her dreams. She hauled her meager possessions out to the property, a bedroll, a few pots, an axe, and stared at what she now owned. It was a wasteland. Jagged rocks jutted from the earth like broken teeth. The ground was choked with thorny brush. The ruins of her great-aunt's cabin were just a pile of rotting wood being swallowed by the dirt. Her dream of a house didn't just seem foolish. It seemed like a cruel joke. The sun was a hammer. The work was torture. She spent days just trying to clear a small patch of ground, her hands blistering, then bleeding, then blistering again. She tried to quarry stone from a nearby rock face, but the sledgehammer, a tool built for men, was too heavy and awkward. It bounced off the rock, jarring her bones and accomplishing nothing. Each night she'd collapse by her tiny fire, exhausted, sore, and wrapped in a silence so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. The loneliness out here was different from the loneliness in town. It wasn't the sting of mockery. It was the crushing, cosmic indifference of the universe. On the fifth day, as she was wrestling with a heavy, half-rotted timber, trying to drag it out of the ruins, she saw him, a figure walking across the scrubland. It was Noah. He moved with that same silent, ground-covering stride, his mule trailing behind him. He stopped at the edge of the pitiful little clearing she had fought so hard to create. He didn't speak. He just watched. Alina straightened up, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a raw, bloody hand. A hot flush of embarrassment washed over her. He was a builder. He must see how pathetic her efforts were. "It's my land," she said, her voice sounding defensive and small. Noah nodded slowly. His eyes weren't on her. They were scanning the terrain, the pile of ruins, her failed attempts at quarrying the stone. He was reading the land, not judging the woman. He walked over to the rock face she'd been battling. He ran his enormous hand over the stone, tracing a faint, hairline fissure she hadn't even noticed. He picked up her sledgehammer, testing its weight. In his grip, it looked like a child's toy. Then, with a smooth, powerful swing that seemed to come from the very center of the earth, he struck the rock. It wasn't a swing of brute force. It was one of impossible precision. The head of the hammer hit that tiny fissure with a sharp crack. A massive, flat slab of sandstone sheared away from the face and landed on the ground with a heavy, satisfying thud. Alina stared, speechless. She had hammered on that same spot for hours and achieved nothing but pain. Noah set the sledgehammer down. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes besides that stoic neutrality. It was a flicker of understanding. "You have a spring?" he said, his voice a low rumble. He pointed toward a dense thicket of cottonwood trees in a low-lying part of her property. A patch of vibrant green she had just assumed was a dip in the land that held rainwater. "Water," he said. "That's why the trees grow here. It's close to the surface." Water. In this parched, dying land, water wasn't just life. It was a miracle. It was a treasure beyond measure. It meant this land wasn't worthless at all. It was the most valuable thing for 100 miles. I didn't know," she stammered. He looked from the spring back to her clearing, at the stone he had dislodged with a single blow. "You're building a house." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "I'm trying to," she admitted, the full weight of her failure washing over her again. "But I don't know how." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if he were weighing a decision that carried the gravity of a mountain. Finally, he looked at her, directly at her. "I know how," he said. Hope, so sharp and painful it was almost unbearable, lanced through her chest, but reality quickly followed. "I have no money to pay you," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The land is all I have, but there's water, and I can cook. I can mend your clothes. I'll give you a share of every meal." She trailed off, feeling pathetic. What could she possibly offer a man like him? He looked at her meager campsite. He looked at her face smudged with dirt. He looked at her ruined hands. And he looked into her eyes, which were fierce with a desperate, stubborn determination that he recognized. "Food," he said simply, "and a place to make my camp." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the land. Her land. "I will help you build your house." A bargain was struck in the dust. A partnership born not of romance, but of shared necessity and a silent, unspoken understanding between two people who had been pushed to the edges of the world. To watch Noah work was to watch a master craftsman. He didn't just have brute strength. He had a deep, intuitive knowledge of stone and wood. He spoke their language. He showed Alina how to read the grain of the rock, where to strike it so it would yield. He taught her how to mix adobe using the clay from the arroyo, strengthening it with straw until it was as hard as brick. They worked from sunrise to sunset, and a rhythm developed between them. She was his apprentice. She hauled water, mixed the mud, stripped the bark from the logs he felled with his terrifyingly efficient axe. The work was still back-breaking, but it was no longer hopeless. With every ache in her muscles, she could see progress. A foundation of heavy, flat stones, laid so perfectly they needed almost no mortar. Low stone walls rising from the earth, solid and true. Their communication was sparse, revolving around the task at hand. More water for the mix. This beam here. Watch your hands. But in that shared silence, a strange kind of intimacy began to grow. She learned the sound of his breathing when he was lifting something heavy. He learned the determined set of her jaw when a task was proving difficult. They were two solitary people, building something together. Of course, news of their arrangement eventually drifted back to Dust Devil Creek. A lone prospector saw them working and carried the tale back to the saloon. The town, predictable as a ticking clock, exploded with gossip and righteous indignation. "It's a scandal," declared Martha Higgins, the preacher's wife. "A young unmarried woman living out in the wilderness with that savage." Andrew Croft's rage was a special kind of fire. This was a multi-layered insult to his pride. The worthless land he'd mocked was suddenly the site of a defiant act of creation. The woman he had publicly humiliated had found not just a purpose, but an ally. And worst of all, that ally was the one man in the territory who had looked him in the eye and refused to be afraid. To Andrew, it wasn't just a house being built. It was a monument to his own humiliation. He rode out to the property one afternoon, his two cronies in tow. They sat on their horses at a distance, watching. Alina's stomach clenched. But Noah didn't even seem to notice them. He continued setting a heavy foundation stone, his focus absolute, his movements as deliberate as the turning of the earth. "Look at him, boss," one of the hands sneered. "Playing house." "Shut up," Andrew snarled, his eyes fixed on the rising walls. The house was taking shape. It wasn't some flimsy shack. It was being built of stone. It was being built to last. And then a realization hit him that made his blood run cold with fury. He saw the height of the walls. He saw the width of the doorframes they were preparing. This wasn't just any house. This house was being built to fit her. It was being made with high ceilings and wide doors. A place where she would never have to slouch or stoop. A home built not to contain her, but to celebrate her. He spurred his horse forward, his face a mask of rage. "Foster!" he yelled. "This is a foolish game. No one is ever going to buy this land from you, not with him on it. Sell it to my father now. He might give you a few dollars out of pity." Alina straightened up, placing her dirt-caked hands on her hips. She was tired and sore, but she was not the same woman who had fled the town hall in tears. That woman was gone, buried under layers of mud, sweat, and newfound purpose. "It's not for sale, Andrew," she said, her voice clear and steady as the stone walls around her. Andrew's venomous gaze shifted to Noah. "And you? Once this shack is finished, what then? You think you'll have a place here? This is white man's territory." Noah placed the last stone in the row, tamping it down gently. Only then did he rise to his full, intimidating height and turn to face Andrew. He said nothing. He just looked at him. His dark eyes were like chips of obsidian, and in his silence, there was a challenge more profound than any spoken threat. A quiet statement that screamed across the dusty clearing. "This is my work. This is our ground. You are not welcome here." Frustrated, impotent against their silent, united front, Andrew yanked his horse's reins. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice tight with hate. "Both of you." He galloped away, his men scrambling to follow. Alina watched them go, her heart pounding. She looked at Noah. He was already turning back to the wall, selecting the next stone as if nothing had happened. The foundation was laid. The walls were rising. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the real storm had not even begun. As the stone walls of the house rose, the invisible walls between Alina and Noah began to crumble. The silence of their partnership, born of caution and hard labor, slowly gave way to something else. It started with small things, a shared look of satisfaction over a perfectly set beam. A quiet, rumbling chuckle from Noah when Alina, wrestling with a stubborn piece of wood, started cursing at it under her breath. Then one evening, as they sat on opposite sides of the campfire, A question broke their comfortable silence. "Where did you learn to build like this?" Alina asked. Noah stared into the flames for what felt like a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "My father," he said. "He was a white man, a stonemason from Pennsylvania. He loved stone more than he loved people." Alina was stunned. She, like everyone in town, had just assumed. "He traveled west," Noah continued. "Met my mother near the Great Smoky Mountains. She was Cherokee. She had walked the Trail of Tears as a girl. Most of her family didn't survive it. She came back, said the land of her people was the only place her spirit could rest." He poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks up into the black, star-dusted sky. They were never welcome. A white man with an Indian wife, an Indian woman who refused to stay where the government had forced her. So they built a cabin far up in the hills. He taught me stone and wood. She taught me the old ways, the language, how to listen to the land. The story hung in the air between them, a ghost of a life Alina could barely imagine. A small boy, caught between two worlds. "What happened to them?" she asked softly. "Fever took my mother when I was 15, he said, his voice flat, but the loss was a palpable thing in the small space between them. My father, he just drifted away after that. The stone wasn't enough for him anymore. I joined the army, became a scout. Seemed better than starving." Alina's heart ached for that lost boy, left alone, belonging to two worlds but fully claimed by neither. She knew that kind of loneliness. Her own reasons were so much shallower, a simple matter of inches, but the ache was the same. "My parents died of cholera when I was 14, she heard herself say, the words coming out before she could stop them. "I came to live with my aunt and uncle. They're good people, but their house, it was never home. It was always too small." She didn't just mean the doorways. Noah looked at her then, his dark eyes holding hers across the flickering flames. "A home," he said, his voice a quiet rumble, "should fit the one who lives there." It was the simplest sentence, but it was everything. He understood. He wasn't just building her a house. He was building her a space to finally stand up straight. From that night on, the real work began. Not on the house, but on the trust between them. They talked as they worked, their stories weaving together like the timbers of the roof. He told her about his time as a scout, the horrors of the war, the casual cruelty of men, and the rare, unexpected moments of kindness. She told him about her secret love for books, a passion she'd never shared with anyone. She told him about the slow, grinding weight of the town's scorn and how it had nearly crushed the life out of her. A deep, quiet respect grew between them. It was the respect of two survivors. And slowly, so slowly neither of them noticed it at first, it began to blossom into something more. She found herself watching the play of muscles in his broad back as he lifted a heavy beam. He found himself listening for the sound of her low, warm laughter, a sound as rare and precious as water in the desert. But while they were building their small world of hope, another world, one of greed and hate, was closing in on them. Andrew Croft's fury was just the tip of the spear. The real danger was his father, Bartholomew Croft. Bartholomew was a man who saw the world in acres and dollars. He had been quietly and ruthlessly buying up all the small plots of land that bordered his massive ranch. He was playing a long game, because he knew something that almost no one else did. The whole region was slipping into a deep, deadly drought. The creeks were drying up. The wells were getting deeper. Water was becoming more valuable than gold. And an old ranch hand had told him years ago about a secret, a legend, a year-round spring hidden somewhere on the old worthless Finch property. The very spring Noah had found on his first day. In a drought, a reliable source of water wasn't just valuable. It was power. Absolute power. He could control the entire valley. That worthless 30 acres was actually the key to his empire. He'd been waiting for the old woman to die so he could snatch it up for pennies. "You let that clumsy, overgrown girl get her hands on it," Bartholomew had roared at his son. "And now you've let her put a half-breed on it to build a fortress. I want that land, Andrew. I don't care how you get it. Scare them. Break them. Burn them out. Just get me that deed." Armed with his father's blessing and his own burning need for revenge, Andrew escalated his campaign. It started small and cowardly. One morning, Alina and Noah awoke to find their sacks of flour and salt pork slashed open, the contents dumped into the dirt. A few days later, a crucial support beam they had spent 2 days setting was dislodged in the night, crashing down and destroying a section of the wall. "He's a coyote," Noah said, his voice cold as steel as they rebuilt the wall, stronger this time, "snapping at our heels because he's afraid to face us." Noah started sleeping with his old army rifle by his side. The atmosphere, once filled with the hopeful sounds of creation, was now thick with the constant threat of destruction. Every shadow seemed to hold a man. Every snap of a twig in the night made them jump. The final line was crossed one evening at dusk. Alina was tending to her small vegetable garden near the spring. Noah was on the nearly finished roof, securing the main ridge beam. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed through the valley. It was followed by a high-pitched zing as a bullet ricocheted off a stone, not 6 inches from Alina's head. She screamed and threw herself to the ground, her heart trying to hammer its way out of her chest. From his high vantage point, Noah saw them. 2 riders, Andrew's men, galloping away into the twilight. His face, silhouetted against the dying sun, became a mask of cold, terrifying fury. He scrambled down the ladder in seconds, his own rifle in his hand. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice a raw growl. His hands hovered over her, his eyes blazing as he scanned for any sign of injury. "No," she whispered, her body trembling uncontrollably. "No, I'm all right." He helped her up, his touch surprisingly gentle. He held on to her arm for a moment longer than necessary, his jaw set like granite. This was no longer about vandalism or intimidation. They had tried to kill her. "This ends now," Noah said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that seemed to come from the deepest part of the earth. He looked at the house. Their house. Its walls strong and solid, its roof nearly complete. It was a symbol of their defiance. And now it was a battleground. "What are we going to do?" Alina asked, her voice shaking. Noah looked from the house to the dark horizon, where the riders had vanished. His hand tightened on his rifle. "We finished the roof," he said, his voice filled with a hard, unyielding resolve that sent a shiver down her spine. "And then we prepare for the reckoning." The final week of building was a silent, frantic race. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a tense, focused urgency. Every swing of the hammer, every stroke of the saw, was a defiant answer to the gunshot that still echoed in their ears. They were no longer just building a home. They were fortifying a stronghold. Noah worked with a furious, controlled energy. He showed Alina how to reinforce the window shutters from the inside, with thick iron bars he'd had the foresight to buy from her uncle weeks before. They secured the heavy oak door with a cross beam thick enough to stop a battering ram. The house that was meant to be a sanctuary was turning into a fortress. When they laid the last wooden shingle on the roof, a profound sense of accomplishment washed over them, mixed with a deep, cold dread. It was finished. They stood together in the main room. The late afternoon sun slanted through the new window panes, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The ceiling soared high above Alina's head. She stood in the center of the room, stretched her arms out wide, and for the first time in her adult life, she could not touch a wall on either side. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Noah saw it. He understood. He had built this house with his hands, but he had built it from her soul. "It's a good house," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "It's more than good, Noah," she whispered. "It's mine." The moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses, and not just two. It sounded like a small army. Noah's face hardened into a granite mask. He grabbed his rifle from its place by the hearth. "Stay inside," he commanded. "Bar the door behind me." Alina looked at the heavy sledgehammer, the one she had once been too weak to even wield properly. She picked it up. It felt balanced in her hands now, an extension of her own newfound strength. "I'm not hiding," she said, her chin lifting. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now resting on a bedrock of defiance. She had bled for this house. She would fight for it. Noah looked at her, at this formidable woman standing tall and resolute, and the barest flicker of a proud smile touched his lips. He gave a single sharp nod. They stepped out onto the wide porch together. Bartholomew Croft led the charge, his face a thundercloud of arrogant fury. Andrew rode at his side, a triumphant smirk plastered on his face. Behind them were a dozen hard-faced ranch hands, all armed to the teeth, and bringing up the rear, looking deeply uncomfortable, was the town's sheriff, a weak-willed man named Miller. "This is your last chance, Foster," Bartholomew Croft boomed, his voice accustomed to instant obedience. "The charade is over. I have a legal deed to this land, signed and sealed. You are trespassers." He held up a piece of paper, waving it like a flag of conquest. "That's a lie." Alina's voice rang out, clear and strong, with no trace of the timid woman she used to be. "This land was willed to me. The deed is filed in the territorial office." "A clerical error," Andrew sneered. "One that has been corrected. Sheriff Miller is here to enforce our rightful claim." All eyes turned to the sheriff, who squirmed in his saddle. "Now, folks, let's not have any trouble," he began weakly. "The trouble is already here, Sheriff," Noah said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a knife. He stood unmoving on the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side, but his presence was more commanding than all of Croft's armed men combined. "You know what they've been doing. You know that bullet wasn't a warning." Sheriff Miller's face went pale. He avoided Noah's gaze. "Enough of this!" Bartholomew roared, his patience gone. "You have 1 minute to leave this property, or my men will remove you by force." The ranch hands fanned out, their hands drifting toward their holsters. The air grew thick, electric with the promise of blood. Alina's heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground next to Noah. It was hopeless. 2 people against a small army. This was the end. And then something happened that no one, least of all the Crofts, could have ever predicted. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. His voice, when he spoke, was suddenly louder, firmer. "Hold on, Bartholomew." Croft turned in his saddle, his face a mask of disbelief. "What did you just say to me, Miller?" "I said, 'Hold on,'" the sheriff repeated. He dismounted, his movement slow, deliberate. He walked towards the porch, but he wasn't looking at the Crofts. He was looking at Noah. "Noah," he said, his voice filled with a strange mix of shame and gratitude. "I haven't forgotten Shiloh." A confused murmur rippled through the ranch hands. Andrew and Bartholomew exchanged a baffled look. Noah's expression didn't change, but a flicker of recognition, of memory, showed in his deep-set eyes. Sheriff Miller turned to face the assembled crowd. His voice was strong now, ringing with an authority no one in Dust Devil Creek had ever heard from him before. "April 1862, the Battle of Shiloh. I was a scared lieutenant from Ohio, pinned down in a thicket, bleeding out. My whole company was dead or gone. A Confederate patrol was closing in to finish me off." He took a deep breath. And then he appeared, out of nowhere, a Union scout, big as a damn mountain. He took out 2 of them before they even knew what hit them, and he dragged me half a mile back to the field hospital. He saved my life. He looked directly at Noah. "I never got your name, but I never forgot your face." Then the sheriff turned his gaze on Bartholomew Croft, and it was as hard and unyielding as granite. "And I owe him a debt. So when you showed me that corrected deed, I did some checking. I sent a wire to the territorial capital 2 days ago. I got a response this morning." The sheriff reached into his own coat and pulled out not a deed, but a telegram. "Funny thing, the registrar's office has no record of your deed, Bartholomew, but they do have a record of a $50 payment made to a deputy registrar. A payment from an account belonging to the Croft Cattle Company. Last I checked, they call that bribery." The silence that followed was absolute, deeper than any desert night. Bartholomew Croft's face went from red with rage to a pasty, sickly white. Andrew looked like he'd been punched in the gut. "Furthermore," Sheriff Miller continued, his voice ringing like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil, "I found the 2 men you sent out here the other night. They got drunk and chatty at the saloon, confessed to everything. The vandalism, the shooting. They're sitting in my jail right now, ready to testify that you and your son here put them up to it." The sheriff drew his pistol, It was no longer the weapon of a weak man. It was the instrument of the law. Bartholomew Croft, Andrew Croft, he declared, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. You are both under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and fraud. Chaos erupted. Two of the ranch hands, realizing their master's power had just evaporated into thin air, spurred their horses and fled into the hills. The others looked around, confused, leaderless. Bartholomew, his face a twisted mask of disbelief and fury, made his last fatal mistake. No milksop sheriff is arresting me, he bellowed, reaching for the pistol at his own hip. He never cleared the leather. Noah's rifle was up in a flash. He didn't fire at Croft. He fired at the ground just in front of Croft's horse. The deafening blast and the spray of dirt sent the animal rearing up in a panic. Bartholomew screamed like a child as he was thrown from the saddle, landing in an undignified heap in the dust. Andrew, seeing his father fall and the sheriff's gun now pointed squarely at his own chest, lost every last shred of his bravado. He threw his hands up in surrender, his face a pale, sweating mask of pure terror. The reckoning had come, not in a blaze of glory and gunfire, but with the quiet, unassailable weight of the truth. As Sheriff Miller and his one remaining loyal deputy disarmed the once mighty Crofts, the townspeople who had followed at a distance began to creep closer. They had come expecting a spectacle, a slaughter. Instead, they were witnessing the fall of tyrants. They saw the beautiful, solid house that had risen from the worthless land. They saw the tall woman, Alina Foster, standing on her own porch, not as a victim, but as a victor. And they saw the giant Cherokee, not as a savage, but as an honorable man to whom their own sheriff owed his very life. In that one moment, everything changed. The whispers of mockery died, replaced by murmurs of awe. Martha Higgins, watching from the back, clutched her shawl to her chest, and for the first time in her gossiping life, had absolutely nothing to say. Alina looked at Noah. The sledgehammer was still resting in her hand. The smoke was still curling from the barrel of his rifle. They had faced the storm together, and they had won. The fall of the House of Croft washed the town of Dust Devil Creek clean. Bartholomew and Andrew were sentenced to a long, hard stretch in the territorial prison. Their empire, built on fear and fraud, crumbled into dust. Their land was broken up and sold off, their power to strangle the valley gone forever. For Alina and Noah, the town's drama was a distant noise. Their world was the 30 acres of rock and scrub that they had turned into a paradise. The house stood proud and complete, a testament to their shared will. In the quiet days that followed, a new kind of silence settled between them. It was a comfortable, knowing quiet, filled with all the things they didn't need to say. They were partners. They were allies. They were survivors. One evening, they sat on the porch they had built, watching the sun paint the mesas in strokes of purple and orange. They talk about you in town, you know, Alina said softly. Noah kept his gaze on the horizon. What do they say now? They don't call you the Cherokee giant anymore. They call you Noah Wolf, the man who faced down the Crofts, the man the sheriff owed his life to. Some of them are afraid of you, but most are respectful. And you? He asked, finally turning to look at her, his dark eyes serious, searching. What do you call me? Alina looked at his large calloused hands resting on the porch rail, the hands that had quarried stone and hewn timber, the hands that had held a rifle to defend her, the hands that had patiently shown her how to build her own life. I call you my friend, she said, her voice full of a sincerity that went deeper than words. My partner. She paused, her heart beating a little faster. My home. A slow, genuine smile spread across Noah's face, transforming his rugged, battle-worn features. It was a rare and beautiful sight, and it made Alina's breath catch in her throat. He reached out his large hand and gently covered hers. His touch was warm and solid, a silent confirmation of everything they had built together. Their love story wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was something far deeper, far stronger. It had grown slowly, like one of the ancient cottonwoods by their spring. It was a love built on a foundation of mutual respect, mortared with shared hardship, and roofed with a quiet, profound understanding. He didn't see a woman who was too tall. He saw a woman strong enough to stand her ground. And she didn't see a savage or a giant. She saw a man with a creator's soul and a warrior's heart. They married in the autumn, not in the town church, but on the porch of their own house, with Sheriff Miller as their witness. Alina stood tall, her shoulders back, her face radiant with a happiness she had never dared to dream of. And Noah stood beside her, his presence a quiet promise of steadfastness and strength for all the years to come. They hadn't just built a house, they had built a life. They carved out a space in a harsh, unforgiving world and made it their own. The woman they mocked for being too tall, and the man they feared for being an outsider, had found in each other the one thing neither had ever truly had, a place to belong. And their home, built of stone and timber, of heart and hand, stood as a lasting monument. A monument to the fact that your true worth is never measured by how well you fit into the world, but by the courage it takes to build your own. If this story of resilience, defiance, and unlikely love resonated with you, do us a favor and hit that like button. It really helps share these incredible stories with more people. And let us know in the comments, what do you think was the single bravest thing Alina or Noah did? For more tales of forgotten heroes and unbelievable history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. Thanks for listening.